Uh, uh, yeah, so essentially in this session, really we want to dive into the financing side, right? So we're trying to really dig into what is it that we can do to scale up access to climate finance in countries affected by fragility, conflict, and violence. And in particular, look at the entry points that the MDBs have and also climate funds have. Where do we see our unique value add in being able to serve fragile and conflict-affected countries? And again, see where we can promote some collaboration, some insights, draw on some solutions that have been developing over the last 12 months, 18 months since Dubai and now here in Baku as well. So we're hoping to have a lively discussion. We're hoping a few more people might also be tempted to join at some point. But we'll run this very informally, right? So again, please feel free to chip in with questions. We want to hear some insights. I know especially the ODI crowd here have a lot of insight too to share. So it'd be nice to, to make it an interactive session. And we thought we would kick it off to start with some voices from the recipient side, right? So we've got a short 3-minute contribution from Hodan, who is in charge of the Somali Bank for Reconstruction and Development. She has a few messages to kind of kick us off, inspire, I think, what will hopefully be a useful session talking about some of these ideas and solutions for scaling access to finance. So if we can turn to the video, and we'll hear from Hodan. Bear with us for 10 seconds while we get this sorted. If not, Marco will do an interpretive dance. Okay, maybe we can turn to the presentation first then and come back to the video if we get it in a better state. Yeah, does that work with you? Okay, all right. All right, we'll come back to Hodan. I can tell you that her wise words were actually quite useful and relevant to the story, but bear them in mind. I'm gonna kind of kick it off with the lay of the land, stuff that pretty much everyone here has heard 55 times, but we're going to go through it anyway. And that's to really just paint the picture of the scale of the financing challenge. And then I want to also pick up on some of the solutions that have come out of discussions, through a kind of a cross-MDB and climate fund working group that convened earlier this year, identified a number of targeted solutions for scaling access to finance. So to have a conversation around some of those and discuss some of those ideas would be really what we were hoping to get out of today, right? So again, shock and awe. The thing I think that most of us will be very familiar with is that fragile and conflict-affected countries really do receive, substantially less in terms of the amount of climate finance compared to other low-income countries. Wow, that went wild. Let me try go back again. It's got like a 20-second delay on this. Okay, so again, most of you here will have seen this, but this is really just laying out the picture of the kind of the challenge we have, right? So on per capita terms, if we weight by population and we look across FCV versus non-FCV groups, we really do see that there is a wide gap, and it's a gap that's been persistent for a number of years on the climate finance side. The really interesting thing, and actually probably surprised a few of you, it surprised me, was that when we look at wider development financing, we don't necessarily see the same scale of that gap, right? Which actually is quite surprising. Kind of, at least my prior would have been that a lot of the reason why we see some of these financing gaps is because of inability to be able to absorb financing, right? And we would assume that that's the same for climate financing as it is for development financing. But the fact that we don't really see this gap on the development finance side points to something that might not be unique to climate, but certainly is something that is not a mirror of wider development financing challenges. So that's something that, is worrying. It's something that, requires and demands actually a little bit more interrogation, and something for us also to discuss, I hope, as we go forward in this session and in others, right? The second bit, again, kind of preaching to the converted, most of you here, is that when we look at fragile and conflict-affected settings, we have to bear in mind that really not all of them are equal, right? So When we talk about, say, fragile countries, countries where it's primarily institutional issues, not necessarily a conflict, we see higher levels of per capita financing going to many of those countries, right? So on a per capita basis, around about $5 per person if we look at a group level. Interestingly, if we look at places affected by, say, medium intensity conflict, these tends to be places where you have isolated conflict, where it's not out and out kind of countrywide. We see the same. So a drop down from non-FCV affected from 7 to 5, but it's not a huge gap. Really where we do see the biggest shortfall is in conflict-affected countries. These are countries where it is much harder to operate, countries where, the financial systems, are much, they're held back by all kinds of physical, institutional, financial constraints, and also where it's hard to even access parts of the country or even the country itself if an active conflict is present. So again, this kind of just, lays it out quite clearly that we're not talking about the same countries when we mention fragile conflict and violence, right? The last other bits, throwing some stats and some graphs at you. For me, this one is really important, right? This kind of paradox, this mismatch between levels of vulnerability within the grouping of FCV countries and the amount of per capita financing that goes to those countries. What we would really want to see here is a graph that, a line that goes from the bottom left to the top right. We don't see that. We see a flat line. We see very little, if any, correlation at all. In fact, if you get your protractor out, you can probably, it's slightly negative, right? Not that that says anything because it's not a significant trend, but we're not seeing the right trends, and that is a worrying issue. The thing that is not necessarily surprising, but maybe points us to some of the clues that we were talking about before, is that when we look at a country's ability to absorb financing, right, its financial readiness, which is, a composite of lots of different things, but if we break it down, it boils down to how ready is that country to manage financing and spend financing effectively. We see a very, very clear line, a very clear correlation, right? So countries that have higher capacity to be able to absorb, disperse, and manage climate finance tend to receive more, right? And that's not surprising. It's not rocket science either. But it points as well to some of the hardships that we have when we work in FCV settings, because in many cases, we don't have the luxury of working in countries where we have some of those sound financial systems in place. So how do we make sure that the people in the bottom left don't get left behind? Recognizing that they are typically the ones that are the most vulnerable, right? I think there is some, it's not just on downbeat, there is some reassuring parts to this as well. The amount of climate finance going to fragile and conflict-affected countries is increasing rapidly. It's increasing at a slightly faster pace than non-FCV affected countries, which is also slightly reassuring. There is still a gap. But we are seeing some positive signs, right? MDBs, this is kind of an MDB, part MDB, focused session. They really are driving a lot of the financing that we're seeing. Now, we can get into the weeds. A lot of it can be, ascribed to issues of how you tag, how you measure, how you account for climate finance. But irrespective, I think, if we look at those kind of measurement issues aside, I think it's pretty uncontrovertible that, a lot of the development financing, even if it's not necessarily fundamentally changing, there are climate aspects that are being embedded into most or a large proportion of development-related financing, trying to target some of the things here that we care about, the most, whether it's mainstreaming core issues of climate, whether it's promoting core aspects to do with adaptation, and recognizing the work that wider development financing as well contributes to adaptation and resilience. Okay? So that's the kind of the bigger picture of where we are at sort of state of play. When we turn to the policy side, we also see that there has been some momentum, right? And again, I'm trying to paint a rosy picture. We sort of started, if you look at where we started from in sort of COP26, this is really where it first, at least we saw the mentions of climate and FCV really being talked about. Prior to that, it really wasn't there. We had in Egypt, the launch of the Climate Responses and Sustainable Peace Initiative, something that actually built quite a bit of momentum to start with, and it really did kick off in Dubai last year with the RRP declaration. Again, pretty much everyone here was very heavily involved in that. And I think anecdotally, at least from my perspective, I've seen quite a tangible shift within our organization, I think 3-4 years ago, I would be running around the institution saying, hey, this is, can we work with you? This is important. We want to push this. Now we say, please go away. There are too many, there's too many of you coming to ask for help. We need to manage this. So, anecdotally, and I'm sure some of you also have felt the same, there really is a lot of demand for this topic and this issue. And that's, I think, testament as well to some of these issues that have happened, at COPs and at other venues. It remains to be seen what will happen, in terms of how the Baku Hub, the Baku Call, the platforms, and the various other instruments, however many there are, they seem to grow every other day. But I'm hoping too that will inspire some, at least some political momentum. Whether it's tangible action at this stage, we can't tell. But it's good to see that that's being carried forward. We have an RRP day. That too, in and of itself, is important in signifying that this is an important topic. So all of these things are good things. But they also need to kind of move from ambition to actual action, right? And that's really where I think, today, RRP Day and the others, that's where we really need to get some momentum behind. How do we think about some of the solutions for scaling up access to finance in fragile and conflict-affected settings? There are some initiatives. On the bank side, we had the SAFE initiative, Scaling Adaptation Finance in Fragile Environments. That was it was mainly just a catalyst, right? And I think all of you here were involved in some aspects of it. We had the Abu Dhabi workshop, which many of you, again, were part of in June. And that, for me, was a really nice moment to get people together from both the funding and the recipient side to actually think about some solutions, moving away from fine-tuning and crafting wording that doesn't politically tie you down to saying anything too strong so that you can't sign it, to actually saying, all of that aside, what are some solutions, what are some ideas that you have that will really promote access to financing in some of these settings, and what do we think we should be pushing for in the next couple of years? So I will talk through some of those solutions that came out of that workshop. But just to say, there are other initiatives aside from that as well that build on some of those solutions. There's the common approach that Marco will talk about a little bit later. And there's, as we speak, dozens of knowledge products focusing on the financing side, which are coming out. ODI had one out just recently. CIPRI had one out, similar sort of timeline. So really this topic of financing and scaling access, is emerging, it's gathering pace. I don't think we've translated that yet to the action side. I think that's where we have our biggest shortfall. But it's good to see at least that we've got momentum that's building. Okay, so if we turn to the Abu Dhabi workshop, again, most of you are here as part of that or played some role in that. But I really do think that is hopefully a turning point too for creating this community practice of funders, right? We had about 50 people there. We focused it on ideas. We didn't really focus too much on policy positions or institutional mandates or anything like that. We just said, come, give us some ideas, help us think through what do you think will actually work in some of these settings. And personally, I think some of the solutions that are outlined in the note that we presented are tangible. They have some actual concrete solutions that could be of use and can help some of the funding and the recipient side think about priorities for the next couple of years. Let me go through 5 of the categories, right? So in that workshop, we actually had, I think, 18. I think it is 18, right? I'm looking at Amir, he knows. About 18 different kind of tangible solutions that were identified. We can cluster those into 5 broad categories, right? Because we don't really want to go through all of them one by one. The first one is probably the easy one. It's low-hanging fruit. It's about strengthening that political momentum. We talked about the development from COP26 through to here and how important the role that's played. Just anecdotally, in terms of getting our own institutions to think about this topic, to recognize it amongst a load of other competing topics and issues. And so that internal political momentum is something that has been valued, but it can be further strengthened. We need to be able to identify some of the champions, whether they're in our organizations or externally, that can push for this topic and kind of bring it out. And also champions to see how we bring in new kind of voices that haven't really played a part in this, in this space. The private sector being a very strong one. We haven't really, frankly, engaged them to the extent that we probably can and should. The second one, kind of grouping, is around building in-country readiness and capacity to access finance. Again, if you go back to the graph of, showcasing the correlations on, country readiness and amount of per capita financing, it really points to this. One of the key bottlenecks that we face as MDBs, as climate funds, will face as well, is that if we want to scale up from, small isolated pilot projects, things that are, just under $1 million or a couple of $1 million, here or there, Those are things that can get off the ground relatively easily. But when we talk about 100 million in the case, of the GCF recently in Somalia, when we talk about larger, sources of financing in and around that, then we really have to be strengthening the public financial management systems of those countries to be able to access, manage, and be comfortable with those larger sources of financing. So I think that's a real key issue that we have a lot of expertise already in, right? And we just haven't tapped it. As MDBs, I know in the World Bank, for example, our partners on public financial management are almost ready to run. They have expertise in how to do this in so many of the different, countries that we're actually talking about. It's just that the climate sector isn't really, we're a relatively new sector. We haven't really built those connections in the same way that other sectors within development or humanitarian action have. So there's some low-hanging fruit as well in just creating those connections, learning from PFM experts and expertise, and drawing that in too. So that's the second bucket. Actually, I would add before we turn, it's not just capacity in country. I think there's ourselves. We have to look in the mirror as well. There's a lot of within funder capacity that needs to be built as well for how do you work in some of these settings. It requires greater flexibility. It requires different ways of working. It requires tolerance of different risks. And I think, frankly, us as a funding community, we haven't really embraced that to the extent that we really, really should. So it's not just you need to improve your systems. It's also, how do we improve our own as well? Information and data. So, I mean, the stats that I presented, will be different to the stats that ODI, just released. The biggest difference for me, for example, is there are orders of magnitude of these people trying to quantify the same things. For example, the UNDP report that was released a few years ago now, I think the difference that they kind of put out between FCV and non-FCV, granted slightly different country groupings, but was in the order of magnitude of say 100 or so, right? Yeah, 1 to 100, right? When we did the same calculations using, again, slightly different countries, but the same general objective, we end up with about 65% less, right? So we're really talking huge differences in how we're trying to measure the same things. That's not good for us as a community of practice if we're really trying to get, on the same picture about the scale of the challenge we face and also some solutions and ideas of how to address it. So improving the way that we measure, which is what Marco will talk about, how we account for, how we go about trying to quantify some of the challenges that we're trying to address really is important. So I'm hoping that this is an area where we can, as MDBs and climate funds as well, can play a big championing role as part of that. The fourth bucket of kind of solutions that came out of that note was around the improvement of coordination, right? I think we're very guilty of working slightly in echo chambers, right? As funders, we like to talk to ourselves. But some of the initiatives that have happened, I think, over the last year, both with regards to the Relief, Recovery and Peace Declaration and with regards to the Abu Dhabi group that met earlier in the year, it was a nice, refreshing, I think, group of people where you can drop some of your institutional, the baggage that comes with that and just think about, different perspectives, hear different insights and challenges from the funder side, the implementing agency side, or from the recipient side. And I think that's the sort of thing that we'll need more of to be able to work closer in this sector and actually deliver on some of the ideas that came out of that note. And then the last thing I'll just say in terms of a group of challenges was around kind of setting the strategic objectives for climate finance. Marco will talk about this in a minute, but it's all good to talk about declarations that are non-binding, that are about ambition. It's all good to talk about great things on how much more financing is going to countries. But we also should be moving in the direction of more ambition, quantifying that ambition if we can, thinking about targets that really point in the direction of where are we heading. So that can be all kinds of different. It's a spectrum. It can go from strict targets where we have measurable and accountable goals. It can be voluntary things where we say we're going to measure things in the same way, but you do so within your own institutional mandate. So how you do that will differ. I think we'll have different opinions as well as to what will be more successful. Because even with a big quantified target, there are always ways to game around it. And sometimes we've seen, especially in climate, that it can actually create perverse incentives instead of actually pushing for the things you really want. So we have to be a bit careful a little bit on that front. But it is important to make sure that we're being honest and transparent and pushing for some of the ambition in a way that we can actually hold people to account. So those are the 5 kind of groups or areas that we saw, as part of that meeting through Abu Dhabi. But I wanted to highlight, just very last slide here, just highlight some of the next steps and the priorities that we see coming. So building on some of those suggestions that came out of the group and thinking about where we head. The first is that we really do see this value in having a community of practice, right? And it differs a little bit in terms of that composition of the group. So having a group that can speak to each other amongst MDBs, firstly, to say, here are some of the things we're good at, here are some of the things we're not very good at. And can we actually have a conversation that allows a safe space to be able to talk about some of those challenges has really helped. So I think having nested communities of practice where you can have smaller groups where you talk about open issues within that group that you can't necessarily do in a public arena is very helpful. But they can't be done in isolation, right? They can't just be limited to funder conversations. And having that bridge, which I think some of the coalition groups, some of the wider kind of climate and funder recipient convenings that we've had over the last year or two have really helped in bridging that gap. So that needs to continue. For now, a lot of that has been informal, though. So how do we move to a process where we can either formalize it or at least ensure that it doesn't die, when a focal point or a champion, decides to move on, and therefore the momentum behind, a coalition or an informal group essentially dies with them. Identifying some of those champions, I think we've done a lot of momentum in doing that over the last year, right? I think the RRP declaration, has really helped us to say who within these respective organizations is the key focal point. How do we leverage, the insight and momentum within their own organizations and push forward to using them as champions within and outside their organization. So I think that has been a big help. But that needs to continue, right? And that probably needs to work up the tree. We're starting mainly at the moment at the technical level, with people who provide those technical insights, but we need to find the higher level champions too within our organizations to take this one next step further. Having strategies, like I said, embedding things into core institutional mandates. Within the bank, we have things like our FCV strategy, dictates pretty much what we do for the next 4 or 5 years within our FCV group. Climate is slowly working its way in, but it's been a bit of a tough sell. And I think, again, with this momentum behind it, we're starting to see, the issue of climate and FCV, creep into some of these wider strategies, which is what we should be aiming for. Not only just targeted FCV and climate kind of, objectives, but also how do we embed climate and FCV into the other wider strategies that our organizations are pushing for. And then lastly, trying to see where those events are, the political moments where we can leverage, right? There's the annual and spring meetings on the bank side, that we have a lot of the people that are here today, that come and convene on a twice a year basis, seeing how we can leverage those, things like COP, things like the Fragility Forum. So there are these moments where we see the potential to actually drive forward some change. How do we leverage them? Do we consolidate and try to push for certain events, whether they're COPs or annual meetings and spring meetings, rather than kind of spreading ourselves too thin? These are things I think that we probably as a community need to talk a little bit more about collectively. But I'm hoping we can pick up on some of these issues as part of the discussion. I'm going to leave it at that. So that was your kind of scene setting for, for at least for the trends and also what comes out of some of the groups that we've been convening recently for solutions and ideas. I'm going to give a second go to the video to see if we're working this time. Otherwise, we'll skip forward either way. No, okay. The world does not want to hear what Hodan has to say, which is a shame, because actually what she said was really good. But yeah, all right. So in that case, I assume I will turn to Marco. And we'll move forward. Thanks.
We'll run through basically the presentations, and then we'll have a bit of a discussion afterwards. All right. Can you hear me? Yeah. So, on the topic of, on all of the different presentations that I do for fragility and conflict and intersectionality with climate change, these are serious topics, and they're probably some of the biggest issues we face in the modern world and the modern society. But I always like to start off with a picture a picture of a monument in Sarajevo that people remembering the food aid that was given in Sarajevo in a slightly sarcastic way, right? It's basically a can of beef that was given as food aid as a monument to the international community. It literally says below, monument to the international community. I think it's an important point. It's kind of, we will be remembered, like this is how some of the interventions will be remembered if we don't measure what we're doing and, you know, we are not aware of what's actually happening. So with that, there's been quite a bit of work going into the common approach to measuring climate results. So this is an initiative between the MDBs, because the MDB, with regards to climate change, the MDBs share a collective vision for supporting countries and other public and private clients to transition towards equitable, low carbon and climate resilient future. And at COP28, it was agreed that the MDBs will actually develop a common approach to measuring climate results that complement tracking our climate finance that we do internally. So this approach is founded on the joint MDB approaches, but also considers each individual MDB's experience and how we actually do things. But here is the important point, and I think this is what also Lindsay was alluding to earlier, is the intersectionality of the different topics and the different issues. So the common approach to measuring climate results actually recognizes the intersectionality of climate change and other topics, such as gender and also fragility, conflict, and violence. This approach will actually be presented tomorrow. So we're a bit ahead of schedule. We're sort of making early announcements almost at the moment, but it will be presented tomorrow. But this is also, like what we're also going to present today, what will be presented tomorrow will not necessarily be the final version. So these are living approaches, these are living documents that will keep getting refined, and also through the use of the approaches, but also in consultation with external stakeholders. So basically, to give an outline of the approach, how it's conceptualized. And I have to say, this is basically your general fragility and conflict person actually trying to explain approaches in climate results measurements, but I think that's actually good to make it a little bit more approachable. So the overall, the common approach does support the achievement of the Paris Agreement goals, and it basically has it actually has 3 levels of indicators, but we'll be focusing on level 1 and level 2 in this discussion. So on level 1, they are basically, these are global and country level, these cover basically global and country level contexts, right? While the level 2 covered the results from MDB operations. And in general, both of the categories are split on the global adaptation and resilience indicators, global temperature goal and mitigation indicators, and country transition progress. So this is the general framework that's presented by the common approach, and somewhat covering the overarching context that shaped these indicators. So first on the results, the indicators include the outputs, outcomes, and impacts, and both include positives and the negatives. With regards to coverage, this covers all MDB financing, not specifically just the climate financing. There needs to be a commonality to the indicators that reflect the common results area at the high level, and even if the tracking methods and the methods of calculation do differ somewhat. So, and these do need to be comparable. So while the definitions are flexible, there needs to be comparability to the indicators. So I think here, stopping for a moment, very important, that it's both compatible and common between the organizations and the MDBs, but also accounts for how each organization does things and acknowledges the difficulties that we would have at this moment of forcing something that would force the organizations to change immediately. And maybe much more about bringing change over time. Then there's the connectivity, or I would call it intersectionality of the topics, and this is recognized in the approach. And finally, there's also flexibility reporting to accommodate each MDB's ability and the extent of the reporting. Right. So when we conceptualized how we integrate into this approach, so how does fragility and conflict and violence as a topic integrate into this approach, we basically had 3 different scenarios. So one scenario was just to have, for each one of the areas, a global cross-cutting indicator and make it completely self-reporting and flexible. This would be an easy way of doing it, but there are also better ways of doing it. So that was our sort of the very base scenario. Then the enhanced scenario, besides the global indicator and the self-reporting, right, would have the FCV indicators mapped to all of the other indicators that are being used, right, across the sectors and basically across the sectors and topics. And that we achieve some common or alignment with regards to FCV categorization. Finally, the embedded scenario would involve the global cross-cutting indicators, the sector cross-cutting indicators, and that there are standalone FCV indicators, and that we have the commonality of FCV category. This is sort of the highest level of ambition. And as we go through the different types of indicators, we'll sort of discuss, oh, sorry, I didn't realize. We'll discuss on how in each one of these cases it would look, right? So rather than bore everyone with huge number of tables, we'll bore everyone with a huge number of bullet points. But when it comes to adaptation and resilience indicators, this is a highly relevant set of indicators in the FCV context, as adaptation action often also addresses drivers of fragility and strengthens sources of resilience. So in this case, our thinking is that we will map, we map the global indicator of tracking percentage of people at high risk from climate change, tracking that also in FCV contexts. Furthermore, for the sectoral results, for water, food and agriculture, health, ecosystems and biodiversity, infrastructure and human settlement, and poverty eradication and livelihoods, we are also looking to map the existing indicators or the proposed indicators under the common approach to track as this is occurring also in FCV contexts. Some of these, there's still room for discussion and debate here. Some of these will be more relevant in FCV and some of them will be less. But overall, the resilience and the adaptation and resilience indicators would be mapped for all of the indicators into FCV as well. Finally, we would actually ask for adaptation of one of the indicators under the access to finance section, which is people with access to finance that promotes prevention, and to have that added to the indicator list. So, yeah, while there's already an existing indicator of access to finance that promotes adaptation, right, we would also like to look at access to finance that would be promoting prevention, So climate finance that also promotes prevention, as this is an important area, and it's something that's still very hard to track and also attract action that promotes prevention. And again, this type of action is what actually prevents fragile and conflict-affected contexts from occurring. So this type, when we discussed the scenarios earlier, what we're proposing under the adaptation and resilience indicators adapts to the more of the enhanced scenario that we were discussing. For the mitigation indicators, under our discussions, we found them to be less relevant indicators in the FCV context. The mitigation does not necessarily directly address the drivers of fragility or strengthen the sources of resilience. This, however, doesn't mean that there is no openings and access points for these two to intersect. So under the discussion and thinking that we had, we are proposing to map the energy efficiency indicators and the renewable energy indicators to track those in FCV contexts, especially because action on those mitigation actions would also address the fragility specifically that are caused by the lack of energy. Something like, in an FCV setting, how much of transport has shifted to low carbon is not the primary concern, but availability and access to energy, more energy being in the grid due to energy efficiency, more renewables, increase in the quantity of energy is relevant. So this is the current thinking on this indicator, this set of indicators, and it generally conforms to the base scenario. Finally, on the country and client transition support, again, this is a highly relevant set of FCV indicators in the FCV contexts. In particular, as the transition to equitable, low carbon, and climate resilient future, and transition away from fragility towards resilience, have significant intersections. So, again, for all of the country transition support indicators, we would aim to map those into the FCV context. If there is any interest later, we can then actually have a look at the actual tables. We have them at the back, but they are a little bit unwieldy to look at on the PowerPoints, right? That's still tracking the country transition support and how it relates to FCV will bring up some issues with regards to the country classifications that all the different MDBs and other organizations use, right? So this is one of the areas that will need future discussions. Furthermore, we would also map the enabling condition indicators and access to intermediate finance indicators also to FCV, while acknowledging that the indicators that directly relate to green bonds might not be entirely relevant in the FCV context. Importantly, the group working on the common approach to measuring climate results left an opening for dedicated indicators that relate to the topic of just transitions, gender, and FCV. So here we are proposing 4 new indicators that track the number of beneficiaries of climate action, and that's importantly including the refugees and IDPs, and that track it across the 4 typologies of FCV identified during our discussions in both of the groups that came together at the COP28, right? And that would include high institutional fragility, protracted conflict, high intensity conflict, and contested territories. Now, again, I'm sure there'll be more discussions on this. We might have to consolidate some of this. But the important thing is, it also does not necessarily conform to strictly to our FCV classifications. Meaning that while, based on the principles, the MDBs will keep reporting what they report. But here, we can actually look more deeply at the context and these typologies of FCV that we've identified, and actually then see how our actions in MDBs map into these typologies. And basically this, the country and client transition support, this basically also conforms to the enhanced scenario with some embedded elements, especially the dedicated indicators. Right? So I'm not going to bore you much more anymore, but let me sort of summarize quickly. So there'll still be a lot of self-reporting on the FCV designation and classifications. And this is up for future discussion, but it's important that we have a starting point. Even if it is according to what we use now, it's a start for us. Then on adaptation and resilience, we would have global level 1 cross-cutting indicators and also match level 2 sectoral indicators. On mitigation, relatively limited, mapping to just some of the level 2 cross-sectoral indicators. On country and client transition support, we would have the country transition progress monitored all across the FCV countries. We will look at enabling conditions and finance mobilization, but being partially mapped. And then we would have 4 new standalone indicators, FCV indicators under just transition, and wider social considerations, labels that reflect the typologies that we have just discussed. Right? And basically, we're presenting the proposal to you today of how we see the indicators at the moment. This is still a work in progress. This is a continuing conversation. After COP29, we will do some further work with the Abu Dhabi group. We will then also work with the Common Approach group to indicate with the proposal they're going to present tomorrow to integrate what we're proposing today. And furthermore, we'll develop an action plan for further development of indicators and their integration in the Common Approach. Right? So I think what's also important is that we continue these initiatives going forward. And we need to manage expectations somewhat. Some aspects of the proposals might require adjustments, and this group will continue to refine the indicators, and we will keep working with the other groups to then integrate them. All right. Oh, sorry. So I would like to thank all of you for being here, and now open for any questions, discussions, and so on. Fariha, maybe if you have the time and desire, if you can tell us a bit more about the Jeff work as well.
Thank you, Marco. Thank you, Lindsay. Can everyone hear me okay? Yeah? So my name is, oh, I'll wait. Hi, everyone. I'm Fariha Iqbal. I'm a senior climate change specialist at the Global Environment Facility, or the GEF, and I lead the adaptation work there as well currently. The GEF, as most of you probably know, is one of the financing mechanisms of the UNFCCC. It's the longest running of the multilateral adaptation funds, actually. Now we have a few others as well. but it has the longest running adaptation portfolio. And while the mitigation finance is for every single non-Annex 1 country, and that includes every single FCV listed country as well, on the adaptation side, the GEF manages two funds. One is the Least Developed Countries Fund. It's for all LDCs, and there is a significant overlap between the list of LDCs and the list of fragile and conflict-affected situation countries. And then there's another fund which is called the Special Climate Change Fund, which provides adaptation finance. Currently it's targeting SIDS, Small Island Developing States, many of which are also on the World Bank's FCV list. Since these two funds came into being and since they started actually implementing projects, they've been providing grant finance to all of these countries. So these countries, including all the fragile and conflict-affected states that are among the recipients, have actually been receiving adaptation support going back well over 10 years at this point, with initial capacity being built in the institutions, the people. Initially, these projects were very basic. Now they've gotten a bit more sophisticated. There was early efforts at setting up automated weather stations, etc. And we've built on those now. And I think one of the interesting takeaways is, it's really important in the case of FCS countries to design well thought out, well crafted projects when you start out, because they can be catalytic in what comes next. You're really building on that. So you want to make sure you do, and maybe some of those early projects didn't have very sophisticated risk assessments and so forth. And that is a lesson that came out in a recent Independent Evaluation Office study, which is that it really is important to have proper risk assessments done, etc. It wasn't a critique, it was just an observation, and many of the GEF agencies actually have their own processes where they implement their own risk assessments. They have their own approaches, tools, etc. that they use towards that. So just wanted to say yes, so under the Least Developed Countries Fund, currently in this 4-year programming period, each LDC, many of which are FCV countries, can access $20 million in grant finance. It's not 100 million, but it's not insignificant. And for many of these countries, that is this current 4-year period building on amounts that they've accessed in time. So it actually cumulatively is quite a bit at this point. And we're hoping that as we move forward, we can increase that cap even further. And then for the SIDS, the Small Island Developing States, this window under SCCF is newly focused. We're starting out with $3 million per SIDS. And so I want to stress this point, that this is for every single country. Every LDC, including the FCV ones, can access grant finance of 20 million. Every SIDS can access grant finance of 3 million. And we get very excited when other agencies such as MDBs come in and are able to offer significant additional support. So we use the GEF finance as, it can, as a leverage, a means of leveraging additional support to scale up the resources. That's always very exciting to see when that happens. Let me see, a couple other things I wanted to mention. So yes, there's this IEO study, the GEF Independent Evaluation Office. I'm going to share a couple things that they identified in their study, as well as this is kind of not even fresh off the press at this point. It's before that, because the GEF is developing new policy guidance on how to deal with projects in fragile and conflict-affected states. It's going as an information paper to our board next month. So, but I'll give you a sneak preview of some aspects of that as well. So I want to start by saying that yes, many agencies shy away. Not the GEF, as I've said, but many agencies do shy away from working in FCS countries. And what are some of the reasons? You can have significant delays. Projects can get hung. You might not get the results that you're looking to see. But I just want to stress that it's more important than ever for us to really focus on these countries for climate finance, because first of all, a recent study showed that 18 out of the top 25 most climate vulnerable countries are actually fragile and conflict affected situations. Maybe you won't end up with like really impressive output numbers, etc., from projects in these countries, but these are the places where the projects will make the most difference. And we can't just walk away. We really need to be engaged in these places. I think, being able to, before you get into developing a project in an FCS country, I'm sorry if that's not, is that the terminology? Fragile and conflict affected situation, I suppose. But when you're thinking of how to develop the project, it's really important to actually go in with a clear understanding of the situation on the ground, the actors that are engaged, the communities, the dynamics on the ground. It's very, very important. You want to try and avoid hurdles down the road to the extent possible. So doing this preparatory work becomes extremely important in this case. You also want to make sure, this is for adaptation projects where, in some cases donors can be a little blind. They might want to go in with their own agenda, and I think in fragile and conflict affected situations in particular, you need to be highly responsive to what the local needs are, the local priorities. You can have adaptation projects that are delivering highly relevant local solutions, such as enhanced water security, enhanced food security, helping improve people's livelihoods. These are absolutely vital in the case of, especially when communities are in conflict-affected situations and so forth. So adaptation finance can deliver a lot of, important solutions that they need in any case. I think what might be less important, might be a project around conserving the spotted owl or something like that, right? We're really looking at what it is that humans need in the situation, or, make it more adaptation relevant. You don't need to necessarily invest in a state-of-the-art highway for these communities, but helping to actually have rural roads that are able to work so farmers can take their produce to the market uninterruptedly is extremely important, again. So it really requires just a bit of a lens of that nature. The IEO studies, the independent evaluation study, also found that climate finance can actually help with peace building. So you can have multi-stakeholder platforms being created as an output of the project that brings people together that might not otherwise come together very readily. And also the projects can provide, obviously, jobs and such when people are very job stressed. Working with local partners is key, absolutely key. This is a finding that not only the IEO but all our project partners the interim implementation reports and such emphasize. We have some projects in conflict-affected states that came to a grinding halt at one point because the agencies that were working there were no longer able to effectively communicate with the government, or chose not to, or they actually just had to pull out of the country. So what happens is, you're left with this bad situation where a project is just hung. And we found that, those projects that actually actively were working with local, with an organization that was local, were able to continue. The implementation continued. They continued to help deliver the results and so forth. And that's because, these organizations are based there. They're not about to leave. They're embedded. It's in these situations in particular absolutely vital to do that. And then when you're thinking about local organizations to work with, you really need to invest in what is it that they need to build their own capacity to be able to deliver the project. So capacity building becomes key. Finding innovative ways to make sure that they can access the finance becomes extremely key. So what are some ways in which the project can sort of build in like a little maybe a community grant or a pool of grants or a savings scheme or some way that farmers can access loans at reduced interest rates. These sorts of like little innovations to make sure that they can actually get the finances becomes very important as well. And then let me conclude with just a few lessons that the upcoming policy paper has in terms of process for projects in fragile and conflict-affected situations, we want to avoid things like cancellation. So can we build in greater flexibility in terms of deadlines? The GEF, and as most of these funders, I suppose, have, you have X months before you have to submit this and X months before that, and if you don't, then what do we do with the project? And so we have been flexible lately. COVID helped introduce a lot of flexible thinking across the board, I think, in many organizations. There are some projects which just got, they've been suspended, and that suspended in some of the conflict-affected states has been extended again. But we want to see something, that's more rigorously in place in terms of policy, in terms of flexible deadlines, in terms of ability to move forward with adaptive management. We want to be able to capture process indicators and not only look at sort of like hard quantifiable indicators, because you may not reach those, but you want to know what happened along the way. Where did you go wrong? Where did you encounter a bottleneck? How did you try and deal with that? So process indicators become very important. We're looking at simplified access. These countries are under tremendous strain in terms of capacity. There are so many climate funds out there, multilateral as well as bilateral. So at least on the multilateral side, there is an effort ongoing in terms of trying to harmonize templates and so forth, templates, indicators, etc. And then I think more M&E budget is important, because monitoring maybe needs to be done more frequently. And then we're looking at also flagging fragile and conflict-affected projects that are in those situations in our project portal, so that they can have special attention paid to them. And I think these are some of my observations. I realize, though, that across the board we need more incentives to bring donors in to sort of feel confident to work in these countries, and it'd be interesting to hear thoughts on that. Thank you.
Lovely. Thank you very much. I actually had a bit of a question, though, with regards to you mentioned about the cancellations, and of course we all know in the financing this is a major issue. And one of the things that the MDBs have been looking at a lot was repurposing of funds, right? So still keeping it within the same country often, but then finding another way to utilize them. And I think you actually had some interesting solutions with regards to that about locally embedded organizations. But what's the sort of the GEF possibility of actually repurposing funds?
Thanks for asking. There's actually a process. There are two ways in which you can formally amend a project. If it's up to, I believe, 5% of the funding that you want to reallocate, you can just do that quite swiftly. Beyond that, the new revised document needs to go for board approval. It's done by mail, but it can happen with sufficient justification. And one example was a Vanuatu climate change adaptation project, which when Cyclone Pam hit, the government wanted to actually do a lot of resilient infrastructure and repurpose one of the projects that had been initially formulated differently. And again, that was done through what's called a major amendment, but it's possible.
Great, thank you. And I think what's interesting about this, and I promise this was completely unscripted, right? There was a lot of intersection about what from the GF side and from the MDB side on some of the key topics. So I think this is actually a very positive and encouraging sign. Now, just from the audience, any questions, comments?
I have a small comment more than a question. I hear all of these discussions happening all the time. I have a very unique combination. I grew up in India. I'm a citizen of Luxembourg, and I live in Ghana. I do farming. I know all the people in EIB, EIF talking about this. I know the government people talking. But somehow money never comes on the ground. I don't know whether you guys check, don't check. Is it it's only your job to allocate, not allocate? But I have been living in Africa for such a long time. and I never see any money coming where it needs to come. Is there a lack of your audit on your side? I don't know what is happening, but money never comes where it needs to come. And I hear so much of talks in Luxembourg, in Brussels, in Strasbourg, in London, at COP, at Davos, UNGA. Money never comes where it has to come. And I'm sure all of you all know as well. How can we do actually something where there's money coming? If you go to someone says our minimum ticket is 25 million, someone says this is that, this is that. Everyone knows what's the problem. Why is the money not reaching? Very difficult question, maybe not. If we could answer that question, we don't need COP30. We would stop it right now. But sorry for putting whoever is on the spot, but on a spot.
No. Look, I'm happy to discuss this one from a personal experience point of view. And maybe I'll give it to Lindsay a little bit for the discussion on the last mile, because that has been a bit of a discussion, right? Look, I get what you're saying, right? I spent years personally not in Africa, I admit, in countries of Central Asia. And it has been a difficult thing. You have to get very involved to make sure that the money goes the last mile. That, this was for water supply and sanitation projects, that the pipes go in the ground, that the toilets get built in the kindergartens, right? And we're organization that we are, right? We have people inside, we battle this every day. We fight this battle every day that, to get our organizations to recognize and move some of these things. Right? Sometimes we're successful, sometimes we're not. Right? I think it is a bit of a generalization. I do know that money has reached in certain places. But to do this consistently, I do agree, is an issue. I personally think it requires a lot more field presence and a lot more different incentives for staff. This is some of the things that I keep on talking about. But also it requires different methods. And maybe, Lindsay, if you can just sort of mention the work that we've done on the last mile stuff.
Yeah, maybe just a quick... Well, it's weird having the earphones in and speaking. You're fully right. I think part of the challenge, though, that we have is that money is certainly going there. But when you look at it compared to the scale of the challenge, that's particularly in fragile and conflict-affected countries, it's vastly different, right? So there is, and we're talking on the orders of, hundreds of millions of dollars that are going into some of these countries, but their demands are actually in the billions, right? Multiple billions. So it's hard to sort of tangibly see that when you see the scale of the actual challenge that's needed to address, promoting resilience, promoting adaptation, promoting wider growth in the face of changing climate. The amounts that we have at the moment, are there, they're tangible, but they're certainly not, bridging that gap. So how do we scale up? That's part of the challenge that we're talking about today. It's an issue not just in FCV-affected countries, though. It's an issue that affects all countries. And so, the movement to be able to generate additional, climate financing in all of these settings is important. And part of what we're doing here today is to try to leverage more and more of that. But it is harder to see where it is on the ground, partly because of those challenges. Any other questions? Manisha, were you going to respond?
Thank you. Lindsay, Marco, you did say we are amongst friends and we are here for an informal discussion. So, and all of us work together. I know UA has questions as well, but some ideas and questions for you to think about. We're not looking for answers. We're here to explore together. The first point, and I'll go in just in random order. Marco, you mentioned that we may not be looking at mitigation because in FCV settings it is not relevant. My analysis from having worked in many FCV countries is that large forestry and agri initiatives get classified under mitigation. They have adaptation co-benefits. And, when we talk about FCVs in Africa, where there is lack of access to energy, deforestation for energy purposes can actually sort of erode resilience and lead to conflict over local resources. So just for something for us to think over and ensure that these countries can continue to access finance for mitigation where it's classified as mitigation. Okay.
Right. So, look, I'm not actually saying that mitigation is not relevant in fragile and conflict-affected context. As this particular mitigation indicators that were proposed, right? So, look, I agree, right? Maybe this is the one where we need to look more terrestrial and aquatic areas under conservation or sustainable management. Because that's under this framework that they're proposing. So some of these things you mentioned are not actually being tracked. That's actually, if you can send me that, and that can be something that can be proposed to them, and then potentially something that we can track in the future. So that was more of the issue there. And thank you for that. You finally gave me the opportunity to switch into my favorite tables of indicators, right? But that's much more of the thing. So it's not that no mitigation action is particularly relevant in these in the fragile and conflict settings. It's more that these particular mitigation action, these mitigation indicators, were not seen as relevant. I mean, passenger trips by low carbon mode or vehicle in fragility and conflict. This is the last thing people are thinking about at that point in time. Or transport of goods by low carbon mode or vehicles. It's more of an effort just to get things transported, not be particularly tracking that. So that's on the mitigation part. Onwards.
Good. I have a couple of other points. Again, these are things to think about. Some may not be relevant depending on how deep we go in the conversation. We spoke about increasing access in the context of the adaptation and resilience indicators. As experience suggests, we have fair bit of access right now, not for communities and people, but even institutions, but access does not always translate into flow of funds. So when we talk about indicators, I would want to encourage you to think about flow of funds and go beyond access. This is again looking at experience of access to, for example, a GCF and an adaptation fund, right? We don't want to repeat here with MDBs. The next point, we've looked. There was an indicator mentioning something on the number of beneficiaries. And often one has seen, when we see project descriptions, I'm sure, you've seen a lot more of this than I have. How do we ensure that we have meaningful figures of number of beneficiaries? Sometimes one just sees figures which we know it's a question of how long is a piece of string. The longer you make the string, the better the case for funding. But as Sharifa said, we have to be meaningful, because if we're not realistic, it doesn't give us the sort of the flexibility we want in the FCV context. And I know UA has a point on beneficiaries and linking that to prevention, so I'll let him come to that, because I also was thinking about that. Yeah.
Let me just address that for a little bit, right? On one hand, I absolutely agree, both on the flow of funds and also how beneficiary measurement is done. Trust me, I have seen all sorts of methods in my time in different organizations, right? Some of it was very rough. But also, the common approach to the climate action has actually been specifically away from the financing flows, because that's actually the bit. The flow of money is one bit that we can actually measure well, right? This is the information that's readily available inside the MDB structures, but it is not something that's necessarily, it's these other things that are much harder for us to track. Lindsay, do you have anything on that particular point, or I covered it on the financing versus results? right? So acknowledge, I know what you mean, right? And also on the tracking of beneficiaries and other outputs, I agree. There has been definitely, and there still is, some not particularly good tracking of it. But on the other hand, everyone is working to improve how it's done, right?
Two more quick points. I think the idea of measurement is excellent. I suppose we will need a plan of how do we bring in these indicators under every program and project that is approved by yourselves, right? And how does it all add up in terms of the bigger picture from taking it from programs and projects? So that would be great. Final question before I give it to UA. Lindsay, this may be silly and provocative in parts, so bear with me. When the World Bank says 45% of finance will be climate, simplistically, can I say that it means that 45% of finance in every FCV country is climate? And if we hold that simplification, how do we ensure that the results measurement takes us up to that 45% of finance in that FCV is climate? Something to think about. Asking this question in an extremely oversimplified manner, because I think ultimately what we would really want from an MDB is to say, when you commit to 45% or 35% of finance as climate, how do we ensure on the ground we have that transparency and visibility of 35% of finance as climate? And how do we show we're measuring it?
Yeah,
I think that's a killer question, right? From our side, what I would say is that all of these indicators, as we're proposing, right, would have a benchmarking of how much of it is done in non-FCV setting versus FCS, right? So it should de facto actually be broken down by FCS versus non-FCS. I've actually looked into the numbers on our side because I was curious. And from a co-benefits framework perspective, right? So MDBs, if you're familiar with it, we do our reporting on climate finance not by the same way that the OECD DAC does. We do it based on essentially how much of a percentage of a project is focused on climate. And to my surprise, actually, in the last few years, this percentage is higher in FCS versus non-FCS. So the co-benefits in bank-related funding for FCS is higher by quite a few percentage points. I was actually surprised by that and reassured. And I'm also in the process of kind of doing some due diligence to see over time, do these trends persist? What sectors are the ones that are driving this? But I was expecting a bit of a gap. Actually, it was the opposite. It was actually higher in FCS. So that's really reassuring. Again, a lot of this, with anything, I think you take it with a pinch of salt. It's all about how you then devise the guidelines to implement these, right? So it's all about what you call climate finance. It's all about how you tag climate finance. So that's why I want to know more about why there's a higher percentage allocation when my prior was there would be less. But it's a reassuring start to see that actually when we look at the accounting, it's not evident that there's a current gap at the moment. So that's one piece of reassuring news. Yeah.
Thanks, Lindsay and Marco. You can tell that a lot of work has already gone into this framework. I have a question on the level of indicators. And if I understood it correctly, at the beginning you said, these indicators will be developed at the output and outcome level. It seems to me that a lot of, pretty much all of them right now are focusing on the output level. So one example could be, I think you had for, say, mitigation, the gigawatts or the megawatts per hour increased. So that I would consider that as an output level indicator. But are you guys also developing outcome level indicators? So thinking still about energy access, for me it would be the amount of energy poverty that is being reduced. And I think that's also more dynamic, right? To track other things like population growth, urbanization, and so on. So things that you can see by stepping also back and how is what we're doing compared to the overall context. So that's one question.
Well, I agree. Always with these, and I do have to say I was so focused on how do we integrate FCV that I didn't actually contemplate your specific question of outputs versus outcomes. It is mostly outputs at this point in time. At the moment, we're basically following what the common approach is. So I think as it evolves, we will also evolve more onto the outcome level indicators, right? I think it was more the discussion of outcomes and outputs was put there by the common approach group to have further space for growth.
So another question, it's similar. It's a little bit perhaps provocative as well. But no. I know that, Lindsay was mentioning this before, that strategies will need to be developed still that focuses on these issues, right? But I'm just wondering at the corporate level if, there is thinking of developing indicators of, say, targeting how much finance is going towards like the portfolio of FCVs vis-a-vis, the overall portfolio. I know that you would need to have like a specific target and so on, but just, is there any thinking and discussions already on this?
Okay, I have to admit, I'll pass this one to the World Bank.
I mean, I can talk from the World Bank side. Maybe Faria also experiences on the Jeff. We don't have a target on specifically how much, but that's why we have a scorecard where we say that every single thing that we care about when we break down our financial numbers, we also do it by how much of that has been delivered in FCS. So de facto, it's trying to encourage us to have equity, right? Where we say, if there's a big gap between how much is delivered on whether it's climate finance or education or health, and we say actually in FCS it's 20% and in a non-FCS setting it's 50%, we see that big disparity. So actually I see the scorecard as being a really nice leveler without needing a target. A target would actually be really difficult to implement and sometimes actually can be, it can create perverse incentives because of the composition of FCV countries, right? They change. You add a country that has a big population and all of a sudden your metrics change. Or a small, if say Nigeria or Ethiopia moves out of the list, you end up moving where you want a lot of people to actually still be targeted. So I don't think actually a target is necessarily best placed in many of these settings, but having something like a scorecard, I've personally seen it really encourage greater interest in FCS without having that target specifically be there. So I do think that there is space for both formal and informal ways of encouraging it. And you do see that, even by introducing things like a scorecard, it has actually pushed up those numbers quite significantly to the point where they're at close parity. And in the case of climate now, actually above parity. So I think, there are simple tricks, that we can use without necessarily having a forced target. Some places, I know IFAD does have an FCS target for some of its spending. In fact, I think it's one of the few MDB partners that does have a specific FCV target. I don't know if Jeff, do you guys have an FCV specific target somewhere?
So in our case, it's a little different for two reasons. First of all, over 65% of our adaptation portfolio is going to fragile and conflict-affected states. But at the same time, we do want to track the FCS countries specifically. So I said we're going to do a little innovation in our portal where each project is going to be marking that it's happening in an FCS situation. Target is difficult because all our programming is country-driven. So we can't have sectoral targets because we don't know what sectors countries will be submitting their projects in. So, you don't want to force that either. Some of them could be submitting them for infrastructure or agriculture or this, so we can't presume what it is that we'll be receiving the concepts in.
And just a little bit from the IB point of view, we don't have targets for fragility and conflict. We don't track it. This is a very new area for us. We have a European Union's climate bank, and this is something we do track quite well. And for me, what is the interest in this framework that we're discussing here? What is the interest in this being introduced? Suddenly, we will actually give a reason, an incentive for EIB to actually start tracking this, right? And that's definitely a good thing. It also has a signaling purpose for the MDBs.
Just a clarification on one of the transition indicators. You said that you are modifying it into, what was it called? People with access to finance that promotes prevention. And I wasn't sure what you meant by that. Prevention to what?
So it's not so much, it's adapting it. It would actually mean a new indicator. So it's this particular one here. People with access to adaptation finance that promote gender equality and social inclusion. We would ask for another indicator. People with access to adaptation finance that promotes prevention. Right? So this is a very specific, and I think it's a very neat technical way of tracking something that's at the moment not particularly well tracked and that everyone talks about, but everyone struggles with. And that's actually a prevention action. Right? So preventative actions in fragile contexts before these contexts become much more acute. Right? I have actually, and Lindsay can correct me if I'm wrong, I have not seen this being tracked particularly well. And to me, there's an opening here where, where we're looking at people with access to adaptation finance that promotes gender equality and social inclusion, of adding another indicator, and that's the financing that also promotes, of course, adaptation, but also prevention. So it will look specifically at adaptation financing that also promotes prevention. And one of the maybe first indicators that will ever start tracking prevention.
Yue, I just wanted to follow on to my answer to you. I wasn't sure if I'd heard your question correctly. The answer I gave was for sector-specific targets, whether we have sector-specific targets. But in terms of overall funding target for the fragile and conflict-affected states within our adaptation portfolio, that is already known. We know that each LDC, FCS country is going to get 20 million in this 4-year period, etc. So there's no need for a target for that.
Please.
Oui. Can you speak in French?
No, unfortunately not. I know I'm from the IB, but I'm...
My English is not better. If someone speak in French, vous parlez français, petit? Oui, oui, merci. Oui, oui, donc je vais vous adresser. Oui, c'est ça. Moi, ma question, j'aimerais venir sur l'outil. Je vois qu'il y a des indicateurs, les mesures de mitigation, que vous voyez qu'ils ont mis aucun. Moi, je travaille. Aucun, cela veut dire n'existe pas non pour les mesures de mitigation. Les mesures de mitigation. Il y a des oui, par exemple, j'ai vu que non là, cela veut dire aucune. Donc, je peux dire, j'ai vu en Afrique, moi je travaille avec une ONG, qu'on travaille dans une zone, il y a problème de conflit lié à l'effet de djihadisme, je travaille au Niger avec une ONG et je suis le coordonnateur. On gère des projets dans des zones de conflits liés au contexte, donc il est en train de mentionner. Ah, c'est bon. Merci. Donc, vous ne comprenez pas. Merci beaucoup. Donc, ma question, ça lien avec l'outil qui vient de partager. Je vois que cela est lié au contexte aussi, qui est lié au conflit. Moi, je travaille au Niger avec une ONG. Je suis le coordonnateur. Des zones de fragilité, là, on travaille dans ces zones où il y a c'est des projets humanitaires et de développement que nous sommes en train de mener. Maintenant, aujourd'hui, on est en train de jeter la paix. On est en train de travailler dans le cadre de HDP, soit humanitaire, développement et paix. Maintenant, je vois des indicateurs qu'on vient de mentionner. Dans certains endroits, je dis que c'est lié au conflit. J'aimerais savoir les mesures de mitigation. Je vois qu'il n'y a aucune. Maintenant, j'aimerais savoir, est-ce que c'est une zone spécifique qu'ils ont, outil a été travaillé, ou bien c'est maintenant un outil qui a été élaboré, que les gens peuvent exploiter ça dans ces zones-là en Afrique, ou bien c'est maintenant. C'est ça que j'aimerais savoir, quoi.
Okay, so I guess to translate it back, so he works in it's the Niger, no? Okay, in Niger, asking about why, from a mitigation perspective, we have none in there, and asking from a humanitarian and development perspective if it's relevant to have none from a mitigation perspective, right? Donc, ce que moi je peux dire aussi, c'est que la raison pour laquelle ici avec mitigation on a mis none, c'est parce que dans les zones de humanitaire, comme vous avez dit, au Niger, la mitigation, c'est pas une priorité première. Vous voyez? Donc peut-être si c'est par rapport à l'accès de l'énergie, là, clairement, c'est quelque chose qu'on a besoin de pousser. C'est pour ça que vous voyez sur Renewable Energy, vous voyez FCV context. Ça veut dire dans les contextes de fragilité et de conflit, on veut avoir des mesures pour voir que l'énergie renouvelable et que l'accès, le plus important, c'est l'accès de l'énergie, c'est quelque chose qu'on incentive. Quand ça devient les autres choses, transport, industrie, c'est pas que par rapport au transport. On ne veut pas vraiment encourager les gens de prendre les moyens de mitigation d'émissions très basses quand ils ont eux-mêmes des problèmes de transport en général, quand ils ne peuvent pas voyager, quand il y a des problèmes, il n'y a pas d'industrie, il n'y a pas de bâtiments, effectivement. Donc c'est pour ça qu'on ne voulait pas mettre de pression dans des environnements où déjà ils ont des problèmes juste d'avoir des bases de développement, si vous voyez. Donc c'est plutôt les endroits où c'est middle income, donc income moyenne. Là, on veut vraiment avoir des mesures de mitigation. Quand c'est un endroit comme le Niger, ou comme le Yémen, ou le Syrie, où ils n'ont pas les mêmes niveaux que d'autres endroits, c'est pour ça qu'on a mis les deux. Vous voyez? Merci.
I think, though, one interesting thing that's come out of the discussion, I think we should slate it for our next discussions within the group, is I think there's no discussion that the mitigation indicator as they are now under the common approach are not particularly useful. But there is space for mitigation indicators that are specific to fragility and conflict, right? So that's something that we'll slate for future discussions. You know, you mentioned this, you guys mentioned this, right? You also were mentioning mitigation action. I think mitigation action in fragility and conflict is another aspect that needs to be explored. And again, we have the group to explore it. Now, while we didn't have, huge crowd today, what is actually really interesting is that this actually generated a lot of discussion, right? So much discussion that we actually ran over time, and so that the people who were supposed to close had to leave, so I get to close, right? So, I think it more talks to the quality of the discussion, and while it's a small audience, it was a very engaged audience. And look, I just want to sort of close this by pointing out that the intersectionality of fragility and conflict and climate change. Basically, those are the two biggest issues that the world faces at the moment, right? Climate change, we all see effects of it almost constantly, and every year more and more across multiple countries in the world, right? I'll point out the SIDS both in the Caribbean and the Pacific that get wiped out almost on a yearly basis. Talking to representatives from Caribbean states recently, it's a yearly cycle after the destruction, reconstruction, and then fear of the next cyclone. On the other hand, with fragility and conflict, we've seen the rise of it over the past few years. The Russian invasion of Ukraine, the current conflicts in the Middle East, right? The fragilities that are happening all across Africa and other places. we're just seeing the increase of it. Often the issue is, those issues are being discussed as separate, when in reality they have a lot of intersection. And recognizing that intersectionality, being aware of it, and also being able to both track what's happening and take action are really important aspects. I think this is where the value of the work of the Abu Dhabi group has been. And to actually point out one thing, that while a lot of the talk today was about the MDBs and the climate funds, right? It's a group that actually brings all different types of organizations and institutions. And the solutions that we present are also based on that. So I think it's important that these groups get embedded, that they keep functioning, and they keep functioning beyond COP to COP, but actually developing longer-term plans that can give us longer-term action. And with that, one of the next things that we actually plan to do as a group is to develop these plans. So I'd like to close with that, and thank you very much for participating.